wait a minute, I never mentioned the numbers. All I said was the entire tree, the entire narco tree must be uprooted.
Whether, as the head of the National Police Service, are you ashamed over...
Why should I be ashamed?
Over
Why?
The recent extradition of the suspects?
Why should I be ashamed?
In 2017, when Kenyan authorities extradited the Akasha brothers to New York, it looked like the end of Kenya's most powerful drug empire. For a moment, the coast was quiet. The biggest drug traffickers in the country were gone, and the DEA had won. But unfortunately, that victory against the Akashas wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous, because as officials celebrated the successful takedown, inside a quiet mansion in Kikambala, a different kind of celebration was happening. Not by politicians, not police, but drug lords. Men who understood something no one else did, that removing the Akashas hadn't destroyed the empire. It had left behind a vacuum worth billions, and someone was ready to take it. A man most Kenyans had never heard of. His name was Swaleh Ahmed Yusuf, also known as the Candy Rain. A man who had escaped Shimo La Tewa maximum security prison not once in 1999, not twice, but 3 more times. Like a ghost in the system, he had lived in the shadows of the Akashas for years, with Swaleh failing to conquer the drug business of the coast. This is because the Akashas had been highly protected by power, money, corruption, and fear. Cross them and you disappeared. But now, they were gone, locked away thousands of miles from Kenya. And for Swaleh, that meant only one thing. This wasn't the fall of an empire. It was his chance to build one. So how did a man like this rise from the shadows and take control of an empire overnight? Welcome. This is Dark Hour Docs. Swaleh Ahmed Yusuf was born in the 1970s into a poor family in rural Kilifi, a place where survival wasn't guaranteed and dreams were often limited by circumstances. Like many children from the Kenyan coast, he was raised in a strict Muslim household, grounded in discipline and faith. His parents later sent him to school with the belief that education would offer a way out and change everything. But for Swaleh, school wasn't the answer. Somewhere along the way, he dropped out, not because he lacked ability, but because he believed there was always a faster way out of poverty. So, in the early 1990s, he made a decision that would redefine everything. He left home. He would travel 72 kilometers away to Mombasa, led only by faith in himself, and settled in Kisauni. This was a city he imagined as a gateway to money, opportunity, and a future worth chasing. But when he arrived, the illusions started collapsing. There were no jobs waiting for him in Mombasa, neither were there any shortcuts of any kind. There he was, faced with struggle and lacked any sudden breakthrough, just survival. He would settled in Kisauni, where the streets quickly taught him their rules. Like many young men with nothing to fall back on, he adapted to the demands of the street. He hustled. At crowded bus stages, he worked as an undesignated tout. This meant that he hanged around bus stages awaiting empty matatus that paid him a small fee to persuade passengers to board. Such jobs involved calling passengers and pulling them into matatus for a few coins, as little as 20 shillings. This was street-level grind that was sometimes unpredictable, unstable, and one made barely enough to survive. Despite the work being relentless, chaotic, and unpredictable, Swaleh kept going to keep his plate full and tap running. This hustle at the bus stage would give him something far more valuable than money. It gave him exposure. In his desperation and struggles in Kisauni, he wasn't just surviving, but watching, learning, and connecting the dots of how streets operate. And it was there, in that chaos, that Swaleh Ahmed Yusuf took his first step into a world that would eventually define him, the world of crime. His entry into crime was not because he didn't have potential elsewhere, but because Ahmed believed there was always a faster way out of poverty. Swaleh's operation didn't start big. It never does. At first, it was small. He began by selling Rohypnol, a cheap prescription drug that was cheap, highly addictive, and easy to move without drawing too much attention. It was just enough to bring in quick cash and open the door to something bigger. In Kenya, the drug was moved in small sachets and quickly gained the nickname Bugizi on the streets of Mombasa for how it left users with a blue tongue. Swaleh continued dealing in the drug until he got acquainted with a man who would propel him to the next level. His name was Masuo Bakari Tajiri, a Tanzanian national, a man who had invested in public service transport and owned a fleet of matatus plying the busy Kisauni route. Bakari didn't just see what Swaleh was, but what he could become as he was able to blend into the chaos of the streets. So he recognized potential in Swaleh almost immediately, and he came with an offer that would change everything: heroin. This was something that scared Swaleh a lot at first, since this wasn't Bugizi anymore. It was riskier, darker, and far more dangerous than what he was used to. Despite this, he recognized that this wasn't the usual small-time hustle anymore, and may have been the lucrative path he had been waiting for all along to wealth. If that was not enough, Bakari made yet another appealing deal to him. If Swaleh agreed to his proposal, he promised to offer him a matatu operating in the Kisauni route that would be used to ferry drugs alongside passengers. And since Bakari knew how to close a deal, he offered him more than just drugs. He offered access, a steady pipeline, the vehicle, and most importantly, a chance to make real money. And that was enough for Swaleh to say yes, and in that moment, without ceremony or hesitation, he crossed a line he would never come back from. Soon, he was transporting heroin through the streets of Mombasa, hidden in plain sight among unsuspecting passengers, moving quietly, efficiently, and without raising suspicion. To anyone watching, it was just another matatu navigating the city, but inside, something far more dangerous was in motion, and as he drove, one song played over and over again: Candy Rain, the 1994 hit song that would unknowingly become the soundtrack to his rise and his nickname. Because before long, people in Kisauni began to notice a pattern. Where Swaleh went, heroin followed. It was everywhere, cheap, accessible, impossible to ignore, spreading through the streets with a consistency that felt almost unnatural, almost deliberate, like it was being poured into the community, like rain. And just like that, he earned a name, Swaleh Kandarini, the man who made heroin fall like candy from the sky. But the higher he climbed, the more visible he became, and in that world, visibility comes at a cost. By mid-1996, the system finally caught up to him and Bakari. Swaleh was arrested, charged, and sentenced to 15 years in Shimo La Tewa Prison. During the same time, Bakari was also arrested and got a life sentence in the same prison for charges of robbery, sentences that for most people would have marked the end of their story in the business of drugs. But Swaleh Yusuf wasn't most people, because while others would have focused on serving their time, Swaleh was already thinking several moves ahead. Inside those prison walls, instead of counting years towards his release, he was silently building a way out, an escape from prison. And somehow, through a calculated mix of corruption, connections, and forged documents, he did what shouldn't have been possible. Without completing his sentence, he casually walked out of the prison as a free man. He did this not once, not twice, but repeatedly, slipping through the cracks of a broken system that seemed unable or unwilling to hold him. Every time, he was able to return stronger, more connected, more protected, and operating with the confidence of someone who was manipulating the system. By the early 2000s, his name had outgrown the streets, no longer whispered in corners, but kept rising above everyone else. However, while names of prominent business moguls made the 2010 list of suspected drug dealers by the Kibaki government, Candy Rain was not there, and he continued to operate in the shadows. His ability to adapt, shift focus away, and disappear when pressure mounted made him an untouchable operator in the drug business of Mombasa. Or at least that's what it seemed, until 2017, when everything changed. On January 29, 2017, when the Akasha brothers were extradited to the U.S., the East African coast held its breath. For years, the family had dominated Kenya's drug trade, remaining untouchable, until suddenly they were gone. And just like that, a vacuum had been created entailing a billion-shilling empire that had no one at the top. It was now time for Swaleh to step up, as he had been waiting, watching, learning, and preparing. This was his moment, and he surely stepped out of the shadows, took control, and started expanding his roots. He rebuilt networks and moved more heroin across borders, especially through Tanzania, and back into Kenya through Lunga Lunga. The empire was alive again, just under new management. At the center of it all was a familiar name, Masuo Bakari Tajiri. The same man once sentenced to life imprisonment was now back in operation, tasked with overseeing the movement of heroin from Tanzanian to the Lunga Lunga border. From there, the operation shifted hands. A trusted transporter by the name Naigoti Bosire would move the consignment to Diani, where it was carefully stored, awaiting the next link in the chain. This was a police officer on Swaleh's payroll who ensured safe passage into Mombasa. Every step was calculated, and every hand involved had a role. And to avoid detection, Swaleh relied on moles who he paid to store drugs in their homes, often located in high-end neighborhoods like Nyali. These locations provided both cover and convenience, allowing easy access to local distributors while staying beneath suspicion. Once the drugs reached the street, the money began to flow. But even that was structured. Swaleh established multiple M-Pesa outlets across Kisauni and Mutwapa, using them to funnel proceeds as legitimate business income. Deposits were disguised as normal float transactions, slowly washing millions through a system designed for everyday use. To outsiders, he appeared to be nothing more than a successful mobile money agent, an image he reinforced by opening a shop right outside his home. It was a perfect cover, and the rewards came quickly. On February 4th, 2017, barely a month into consolidating power, Swaleh signed an agreement to acquire 4 vehicles worth 7.6 million shillings. This was a bold move, too bold that it caught attention. Authorities began tracking his movements and soon uncovered evidence linking him to drug trafficking operations worth over 47 million shillings in Bamburi. And the response was swift. Swaleh was arrested and found in possession of 18 million shillings in cash and 17 kilograms of heroin. But Swaleh remained unfazed. He secured bail and returned to business almost immediately, continuing operations as though nothing had happened. Even in July 2017, when he was arrested again, this time alongside his wife in possession of heroin, he showed no signs of slowing down. Pressure was building, but so was his defiance. The empire was growing, and so were the risks. On September 20th, 2018, police raided a house in the Kikambala housing estate tied to Swaleh and his partner, Fatuma Ahmed Ali. Inside, they found over 91 kilograms of heroin hidden, ready for distribution. It was not just another seizure, it was a statement. The operation led straight back to Swaleh, and this time the scale was too large to ignore. The media quickly picked up the story, branding him the new heir to the coastal drug empire. His face was no longer hidden, it was everywhere. Swaleh and his associate Fatuma Ali were arrested. Given his history as a repeat offender, the court initially denied him bail. But even that did not slow him down. From behind bars, he continued to push boundaries. In a desperate attempt to secure his freedom, plans were set in motion to steal title deeds worth millions from a Malindi court, documents that could be used as collateral for bail. But the plan failed terribly. And while it could not be directly pinned on him, it exposed just how far he was willing to go. Eventually, after persistent legal battles, Swaleh secured bail. But by then, something had shifted. The game had changed. This was no longer just about law enforcement. One by one, people around him began to fall. His network, once solid, started to fracture under pressure. Associates disappeared. Others were found dead under mysterious circumstances. Masoul Bakari Tajiri would be the first to be found lifeless, his body bearing signs of torture, a message that was directly aimed at his boss.
Now cross over to Mombasa, where families of 3 men from Mombasa who have been missing for 18 days now are crying for help to trace their whereabouts. The 3, Masoul Bakari, Hussein Mohammed and Fahmi Bakari, are said to have gone missing while en route from Nairobi to Mombasa in Maungu area on the 9th of December.
Swaleh understood it clearly. He was next. From that moment on, he lived cautiously, constantly looking over his shoulder, aware that the danger surrounding him was no longer predictable. Even before he could process the death of his right-hand man, the driver Bosire turned up dead. And then, on March 8, 2023, it came for him. At around 6:45 p.m., a group of men arrived at his home and took him without any struggle or resistance. Swaleh was taken by 7 men who had arrived in 2 vehicles. 9 days later, his body was discovered in a thicket in Kiriwitsu near Vipingo in Kilifi. He had suffered a single gunshot to the head, just below the right ear, after his body was discovered by a boda rider while half naked. But the mystery remained. Was it rival networks, internal betrayals in the family, or the police? No definitive answer ever came. His empire collapsed almost as quickly as it had risen. His wife was sentenced to 40 years in prison and fined over 825 million shillings, an amount nearly impossible to raise. Properties linked to him were also seized, bank accounts frozen, and his assets were registered under proxies to be dismantled piece by piece. What remained was not power, not wealth, but a story. The rise and fall of a man who built an empire in the shadows and paid the ultimate price for it. This has been Dark Hour Docs. Thanks for watching.